Hi there, so in this video I'm going to talk to you about trauma. I'm going to talk to you about what constitutes trauma, what happens inside your brain and your body when you experience trauma. I'm going to talk about what makes certain people more vulnerable to trauma. And I'm going to talk about how trauma and anxiety are linked as well. So let's start by defining trauma, shall we? So when you think about trauma, what kind of events do you imagine? Now, very often when you think about trauma, emotional trauma in particular is what we're talking about here, we think about events that we refer to as trauma with a big T. So big events, we think about maybe war, abuse of various kinds, physical or sexual abuse or assault. Now, although these traumas are very important, these are not the traumas that I'm going to focus on today. I'm going to focus on what we call trauma with a small t. So these are the kind of events that may seem less severe and less significant, but if they happen over time, particularly if they happen in childhood, they can very much shape who we believe we are, and they can very much impact how we behave in the future as adults, and they can certainly impact how we deal with stress and anxiety and how vulnerable we are to mental health problems and specifically anxiety as well. So let's talk about what makes some people more vulnerable to trauma than others, shall we? So first of all, there is a nature element. Some people are more sensitive by nature, by temperament, and these people that are more sensitive feel everything more than those of us that are less sensitive. So if you are sensitive by nature, as many of us are, you are more vulnerable to trauma. So there are some biological or some nature, if you like, sensitivities there, vulnerabilities. And then we have childhood experiences. This is probably the most important one. There are a number of adverse childhood experiences that we can experience, and if we do, the likelihood of us experiencing these as a traumatic event are quite high. Now, there is an inventory called the Adverse Childhood Experience Inventory, where you can see this inventory online, and there are 10 examples that not every single trauma you could experience as a child, but the more adverse childhood experiences that you've experienced on this list, the more likely you are to experience trauma and a traumatic response at the time. And you may not necessarily be aware of that, but it might manifest in terms of how you respond to stress, your mental health as an adult, your relationships, particularly relationships actually. When you've experienced childhood trauma, a lot of the problems that show up later in life as an adult are often within our close relationships. So I want to explore what happens when we experience trauma, help you to understand what your brain is doing and why it's doing it, and then discuss some of the behaviors, some of the traits that manifest when you've experienced trauma as well, and how that links to anxiety. So first of all, when it comes to trauma, trauma is not something that is contained within the event itself. Now, although we refer to events as being traumatic events, and that's true, it makes sense why we talk about traumatic events, it's not actually accurate in the sense that trauma is something that happens inside of us. Trauma is our response. Trauma is the experience that happens in our brain, in our nervous systems, in our bodies when we're overwhelmed. Now, traumas with a small t, which can include things like emotional neglect or inconsistent caregiving, for example, things that may seem less significant, but if they happen repeatedly over time, they can very much have an impact on our brains and very much have an impact on our sense of self, who we believe we are. And this is what I want to talk to you about in particular. The younger you are when you experience trauma, the less defenses you have, the more vulnerable you are. A child doesn't have the defense mechanisms in their brain that an adult has. A child doesn't have the ability to make sense of situations in the way that our more advanced adult brain can do. So let's explore some of the vulnerabilities, some of the aspects that contribute to trauma and make us more vulnerable to trauma before we explore what happens in the child's brain when you experience trauma and how that later manifests as an adult. So there is a concept in psychology called the window of tolerance. Now, your window of tolerance is how much you're able to cope with before you become overwhelmed. And that's very much what happens with trauma. There's an overwhelming of your nervous system. Sometimes, as in the case of shock trauma, it's something happening quickly, too fast and too much for your nervous system, and you become overwhelmed. Whereas other times it can be an ongoing process where your window of tolerance becomes narrowed more and more over time. So there are three factors in particular that narrow your window of tolerance. And the narrower your window of tolerance, the more likely you are to experience trauma and the more vulnerable you are to mental health problems later in life as well. The first one is adverse childhood experiences. Now, when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, we can look at two categories. We can look at trauma of commission and trauma of omission. So trauma of commission are the things that happened and shouldn't have happened. Okay? And then we have the trauma of omission, which are the things that should have happened and didn't. So the first ones, maybe that's more obvious, the kind of things, the various kinds of abuse that you can experience, things that shouldn't have happened. Omission, however, maybe that's less obvious, but research has shown that these experiences can be just as damaging to our brain, just as damaging to our mental health as the trauma of commission. So the things that should have happened and didn't, what kind of things could we mean here? So we're referring to criticism, we're referring to being constantly judged, we're referring to inconsistent caregiving, emotional neglect. All these things are trauma of omission. But also within that, very important one is not being able to be who you are, not feeling safe enough to be able to be who you are and express your wants, your needs, and your desires. That can very much have a traumatic effect on the brain. Then we have shock trauma. I'm not going to deal with shock trauma so much, but as I said earlier on, that's an overwhelming of the nervous system, something happening very quickly, and it's too much for the brain to be able to process, and you become overwhelmed. And then we have ongoing stress without adequate recovery. How many of you, I wonder, fit into that category? Life is difficult, isn't it? Life is stressful, no question about that. No point in pretending that it isn't. But if you don't allow enough time to be able to truly and adequately recover, that can also narrow your window of tolerance as well. So if you've experienced a range of adverse childhood experiences, developmental trauma, shock trauma, and ongoing stress without adequate recovery, then you're certainly going to be more vulnerable to experiencing trauma and also experiencing mental health problems later in life as well.